Hello, my name is Dr. Margaret Holland, and I am a family medicine doctor. I practice at Baylor Scott & White Family Medicine, Fort Worth, here in the medical center. We are located on Magnolia, and I always tell everybody we're across the street from Yucatan Taco Stand. And so I was asked this evening to discuss nutrition for endurance, which is an area that is very complex. And I'm trying to just give you some information today that helps give you a little bit of guidance of how to design your nutrition plan while you're training for the marathon. So my goal today is just to provide some generalized evidence-based recommendations that hopefully will help you optimize your health and your performance during your training and on your race day. Now, this is especially important that you have to tailor these recommendations to your own personal nutritional and medical needs. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, nutrition is not a one-size-fits-all, and everybody is on their own personal nutrition journey. So I encourage you to take my recommendations with a grain of salt and adjust them to what you need in your day. And then I also am just going to give you an idea that I'm not going to be discussing special diets today. There is a lot of information on how to train with special diet recommendations. I'm just not going to cover those today. A lot of patients and athletes are on keto diets, diabetic diets, DASH diets, etc. And so if this applies to you and you need some further guidance, I recommend that you discuss with a nutritionist or a physician of how to adjust your diet for your training needs. And then also, just to kind of keep this a little simpler, I'm not going to discuss today about hydration, electrolytes, and supplements. There is a lot of information out there, and I encourage you to read about it, especially it is important during marathon training to know about hydration. But today we're not going to talk about that. All right. So the basics of nutrition, the building blocks of nutrition include macronutrients and micronutrients. And you may have heard of these things before. So macronutrients include things like protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And that's my focus of today's discussion. I am not going to discuss micronutrients. They are extraordinarily important to your health, but just as for a matter of time, we're just going to focus on macronutrients today. But micronutrients include vitamins, minerals, and supplements, things like probiotics and caffeine, things that you may be taking to kind of help supplement your training. So a good thing to kind of think about when you're developing a nutritional track is how to track your daily nutrient needs. It does get complex, and we'll get into it in a little bit. But it's a good idea to go ahead and know your daily caloric needs. And this is going to change as your training progresses. Probably at this time, you're not up in your mileage. You're doing, a lower amount of mileage several times during the week, but you may on the weekends, have a longer run. And so it's really important to know kind of what your basic needs are, and then you can adjust from there. And so daily caloric needs are based on your weight, height, age, gender, and activity levels. With just a quick Google search, when I was preparing this, I found a number of resources online where you can go and calculate those needs. I saw something on Mayo Clinic. I'm a big MyFitnessPal fan, and there's a lot of other online calculators for that. It also helps if these resources help you track your macronutrients. I know MyFitnessPal does, and there's a lot of other app-based calculators and computer-based calculators that can help you track your macronutrients. And then I just want to note there is some math involved with nutrition. One basic conversion factor is a lot of the weights are done in kilograms. And I just put there at the bottom, just for a refresher of your high school math, that 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So an 150-pound female, you divide it by 2.2, it's 68 kilograms. And a 200-pound male divided by 2.2 is 91 kilograms. I'm going to start today talking about protein needs. And I know that endurance training, the focus is always on carbohydrates and how to time your carbohydrates. But I think that protein is very underemphasized. And I think it is very important in your training, especially when you're trying to maximize your performance. The purpose of protein is to build and replenish your lean muscle tissue. And it can also serve as a source of energy in times of caloric deficit. And one of the things that you want to avoid when you're doing endurance training is the body's need to use protein as a source of energy, and to keep your lean muscle tissue on so that you have it when you need it in your longer runs. There are two different types of protein. There's animal-based protein and there's plant-based protein. Animal-based protein is considered a complete protein because it contains all 9 essential amino acids. So for example, if you eat some beef, fish, chicken, eggs, or milk, you're getting all 9 essential amino acids with each serving. On the other hand, a plant-based protein is considered an incomplete protein because it doesn't contain all the essential amino acids in every serving. That doesn't mean that they're not good for you. In fact, I think they're fantastic sources of protein. However, just be aware that each one individually does not contain a complete protein profile. And so it's important to combine different types. The reason why you see a lot of beans with corn is because together they make a complete and essential amino acid profile. And so I just gave some examples of plant-based protein sources like nuts, nut butters, oats, broccoli, chia seeds, quinoa, and hemp seeds. So protein should account for about 10 to 35% of your daily caloric intake. Again, just going back to what I was saying previously, it's a reason why it's a good idea to kind of estimate how many calories a day that you should be eating to maintain your training. Protein for a normal healthy adult is around 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. However, when you are training for an endurance event, you should actually increase that amount to about 1.4 grams per kilogram per day. And there's a reason for that. And it's because endurance training is catabolic. It breaks down your muscle. And so to replenish those stores, the protein requirements are higher. And like I said earlier, you don't want to be using your protein stores, your muscle, as an energy source. So it's important to replenish it every time you use it. And now I gave you that 1.4 grams per kilogram per day goal. However, vegetarian athletes may require even more grams a day because plant proteins, like I was saying earlier, are incomplete. And so you might be eating a lot more and different types of proteins to meet your protein requirements in a day. Just to give you examples of our 150-pound female and our 200-pound male, that means it's about 95 grams of protein a day and 127 grams of protein a day. To add a little bit more complication to protein, the body can only absorb about 0.3 grams per kilogram every 3 to 5 hours. So going back to our male and female athletes, a 150-pound female can only absorb about 20 grams of protein every 3 to 5 hours, and a 200-pound male only 27 grams every 3 to 5 hours. So if you're trying to meet those nutritional needs, you're going to have to spread your protein out throughout the day so that your body can absorb everything that you're taking in. So, that 150-pound female, she needs to reach that 95-gram goal. So you might need to do 20 grams spread over 3 to 4 meals, and the 200-pound male, 27 grams spread over 3 to 4 meals. And then there is an element of timing to protein. It's important to time one serving of your protein, that 20 grams for the 150-pound female or the 27 grams for your 200-pound male, immediately pre or post your training. Again, we're trying to avoid that catabolic state where your body is using protein as an energy source and that you're repleting all of the protein that was used during your training or on race day. And so you want to time it right around that training. Some athletes prefer it pre-training and some athletes prefer it post-training. It really doesn't matter. And I would just encourage you to do it to what you feel is most digestible. If is going to make your stomach upset to eat your protein before you train, I would just do it afterwards. And again, the purpose of it is to prevent muscle breakdown, which can over time lead to decreased performance. And I just put a little caveat at the end here. I recommend against only BCAAs as they're not complete proteins. A lot of athletes like the branched chain amino acid supplement drinks, and they're great, except they're not complete proteins. So you would need to combine that with another protein source in order to complete the amino acid profile and get your complete protein needs. So now I just wanted to touch on carbohydrates. And this is usually what everybody's thinking of when they're thinking about nutrition during endurance training, because, you know, you've heard of athletes hitting the wall, using up all of their glycogen storages, and so that they just have zero energy left to get through the rest of the race. And so it's important to learn what carbohydrates to use and when to use them to avoid that type of sugar dip. And so there's two main types of carbohydrates. There's simple carbohydrates, also known as simple sugars. These include glucose, dextrose, and fructose. And these sugars break down very quickly in the body. They're great at supplying energy, but they lack fiber, vitamins, and other key nutrients. And so for an everyday individual, we try to avoid simple sugars. But these are actually really important for an athlete, especially an endurance athlete who's trying to keep their energy levels up during a race. So examples of simple carbohydrates are fruits, milk, table sugar, candy, and soft drinks. But this also includes the supplements that we see endurance athletes use, like sports drinks, energy gels, energy bars, and energy chews. And those come in really importantly while you're training, while you're in your marathon, to keep your energy levels high. There's also complex carbohydrates. They break down much more slowly in the body, and that's because they're often packaged with fiber, vitamins, and other nutrients that make it harder for them to be broken down. And they also supply energy, but it's a more sustained, not a quick release energy. It's more of a sustained energy. Examples of these are beans, whole grains, whole wheat pasta, potatoes, and corn, and the list goes on and on. Excuse me. Carbohydrates during training are really important, and they should account for about 45 to 65% of your daily caloric intake. So they're about half of what you should be taking in calories a day. And the recommendations of how many carbohydrates you're taking in is based on the amount of exercise that you are doing every day and how your exercise is increasing as your training increases. So if you're in the early stages of training and you're just doing moderate runs, an hour or less a day, you really only need about 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. If your training is progressing, you're doing some longer runs, on those days, you're going to want to aim for a higher amount of carbohydrates, 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. And then for very high exercise days, 4 to 5 hours or maybe leading up to your race day, you're going to aim for a lot more carbohydrates, 8 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. Just to kind of give that in numbers, for example, an 150-pound female on moderate training days, and she's trying to keep around 5 grams a day per kilogram per day, that's 340 grams of carbohydrates. But on very high days, she could go up to even 800 or more grams per day. For the 200-pound male, and that's more like 455 grams on a low, moderate exercise day to over 1,000 on very high exercise days. Timing is what everybody really focuses on in endurance training. And this is something I really recommend that you practice, because you don't want to get to race day and it be the first time you try to figure out what's your optimal carb timing situation. So I'm sure you've heard of carb loading, which is where you're trying to up your carbohydrate stores and your glycogen stores leading up to your race or your long training day. So prior to that event, if the event is less than 90 minutes, so say maybe you're doing a 10K as part of your training to get up to the marathon, in the 24 hours prior to that event, you're going to focus on increasing your carbohydrates to about 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. However, if that event is going to be longer than 90 minutes, so your actual marathon, if you're using a training half marathon, in the 24 hours prior to that event, you're going to aim for the 10 to 12 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrates. And what's also important is often race day starts in the morning after you've been fasting all night. And so in the final 1 to 4 hours before an event, it's important to kind of give yourself another kind of carbohydrate boost. And this is intended to top off your glycogen stores. And this single dose of 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate will help do that. And that should be focused on easy to digest carbohydrates. They don't have to be simple carbohydrates, but just ones that you feel would be gentle on your stomach and wouldn't upset it prior to your race. Now, during the event, what we call fueling, it's important to keep your carbohydrate levels high. So for an event that's less than 2.5 hours, this is actually not weight-based. This is just general recommendations for everybody equally. About 30 to 60 grams of simple carbohydrates per hour is the recommendation. Remember, I talked back about the simple carbohydrates. This is when those sports drinks, gels, goos, chews come in handy because you can get your simple sugars in quickly in that way. For an event that's greater than 2.5 hours, so again, on your marathon day, that number increases because you're in that much more burning of energy state. So it's more like 60 to 90 grams per hour as tolerated. However, this is one of those reasons why it's really important for you to practice this. Higher doses may lead to GI upset. What sugar is osmotic, meaning it draws water in wherever it goes. So if you're putting in a bunch of sugar into your stomach, it's going to draw water in to that stomach. A lot of times that leads to nausea, vomiting. Some other patients, it could lead to more like GI upset, diarrhea. And so you need to kind of figure out and practice in your training on how much of these carbohydrates you can tolerate. Higher doses doesn't necessarily mean it's better for you. You're just trying to figure out what's the best for you to optimize your energy levels throughout your race. Then after the event, you're in the replacement part of carbohydrate timing, which is just you're trying to replete all of the carbohydrates you have burned up during that race. So over the next 24 hours, you're going to try to keep your carbohydrate levels up. So trying to focus on 8 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. However, in the first 3 to 5 hours, you're going to want to focus on those and getting a higher level over that time period at about 0.8 grams per kilogram per hour. So that was a ton of information about carbohydrate timing. So I just kind of wanted to break it down and show you what that means for our two athletes, our female and male athletes. So you'll see with the 150-pound female, say this is race day. This is the day of the marathon. So prior to that event, she's going to do her carbohydrate loading. So she's going to focus on that high amount of carbohydrates in that prior 24 hours. This is the 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per day. So that's for her 680 to about 800 grams of carbohydrates. And remember, because it's a longer event, she's going to want to do that top off of her glycogen stores. So in those few hours leading up to the event, she's going to use some easy to digest carbohydrates, either 68 to 200, maybe a little bit more grams of carbohydrates to just top off her stores. And then during her race, she's going to try to keep fueling throughout it. If her race is shorter, it's not a full marathon, she's going to aim for about 30 to 60 grams per hour to keep her energy levels high. Whereas if on the long race days, she's going to aim for more to 60 to 90 grams per hour. And again, those are the simple carbohydrates, the quick, easy to digest carbohydrates. And that's just as you can tolerate it, keeping in mind that more may end up affecting your GI tract. And then after event, when she's resting at home for that next 24 hours, she's going to aim for about 545 to 680 grams of carbohydrates. But in the first 3 to 5 hours, she's going to try to get in about 55 grams per hour just to kind of replete the stores that she had lost. On the other side, our 200-pound male, he's going to be doing the same thing, but notice that his amounts of carbohydrates are very different before the event and after the event. So in that prior to 24 hours, that day before the event, the carbo loading day, he's going to aim more for 900 to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. And his glycogen store top off, he's going to aim for 90 to over 300 grams of carbohydrates. The fueling for him, though, stays the same during the shorter races, aiming for 30 to 60 grams per hour. And in the longer races, 60 to 90 grams per hour of those simple carbohydrates to keep the energy levels. And then after the event, over the next 24 hours, trying to get in 700 to 900 grams of carbohydrates. And in the first few hours after that race, aiming at about 73 grams an hour of carbohydrate. The final subject I wanted to talk about is fat. And again, I think this is a very underemphasized macro nutrient. Fat is really important for us. And for that reason, it should not account for any less than 20% of daily caloric intake. It may seem overwhelming because you're trying to aim your carbohydrates and your proteins, and how are you going to even get that fat in? But you shouldn't fear it. It should be an important part of your daily nutrition requirements. And this is because fat is really important. It has 6 major roles in our bodies. It supplies energy. It's a great energy source. It helps manufacture and balance hormones. I spend a lot of my day talking to patients about hormones and hormone balance. And often the time is the answer for them is that they need to add fat to their diet. They're under eating fat. It forms cell membranes, and this goes part to the training. We talked about running as a catabolic state. So to keep your cell membranes strong in your muscles, you have to have fat to do that. It forms the brain and the nervous system. Fat's really important to keep your brain functioning. I don't know if you've ever had a very carb-heavy lunch, a big like pasta lunch, and then when you try to go back to work in the afternoon, you just crash. And that's because the brain doesn't really like to work very much off carbohydrates. It really likes fat. So, they always tell you to avoid the energy slump, to eat more protein and fat-rich lunches. And so that's where that's coming from. It also transports fat-soluble vitamins. I know we didn't talk a lot about vitamins today. Most people who I test are deficient in vitamin D, and that is an important part of its viability in the body. So you can be taking your vitamin D supplement every day, but if you don't have enough of your daily intake of fat, it's not functional. And then finally, it supplies 2 of the fatty acids that are essential to body function that the body can't manufacture itself. And for those interested, those are linoleic acid and linolenic acid. I do encourage you to focus on the healthy fats. Not all fats are created equally. I think that the American diet is overly heavy in saturated fats and trans fats and the very unhealthy fats out there. So I just created a list of fats to focus on to kind of help and focus on during your training and to give you the optimal nutrition. A fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, or tuna. Avocado or avocado oil is really great for you. Seeds are a fantastic source of fat. Sunflower, sesame, and pumpkin seeds, they all have healthy fats in them. And then sunflower butter and sesame butter are also good sources of fat for those who can't tolerate nuts. One thing I would say about seeds, though, is that I recommend against seed oils. They have to be very heavily processed to be put into oil form. And so sunflower oil, sesame oil, canola oil, grapeseed oil, I recommend that they are kept to a minimum in your diet. Nuts and nut butters are fantastic sources of fats. I gave a list of them. Again, with the nuts, I recommend against using their oils to cook with, except in minimal state. Instead, I recommend olive oil. And like I said, the avocado oil earlier. Eggs are a great source of fat as well as protein. Flaxseed, beans also have fat and protein and carbohydrates. Beans are a fantastic meal to add to your diet when you're in training. And then I added at the very bottom, grass-fed organic proteins. Again, we want to focus on proteins in our diet, and so they can also be a source of fat for you. I try to encourage you to buy the best protein that you can financially afford. You can go crazy spending money on all kinds of fancy meats, but if you can afford grass-fed and organic, it really is a higher quality fat. So I just put together a chart that you can look at quickly to kind of just refresh your mind with the recommendations that I made about nutrition requirements and timing, just to kind of review what we talked about. Protein should be about 10 to 35% of your total calories. You want to increase it to about 1.4 grams per kilogram per day while you're training, and spread that out in a smaller amount every 3 to 5 hours, about 0.3 grams per kilogram every 3 to 5 hours to help your body absorb the protein you're taking in. Before exercise or immediately after exercise is a great time to get one of those doses of protein in. Excuse me. And that's to prevent that catabolic state that we've discussed. Carbohydrates are, we recommend about 45 to 65% of your total calories, and you're going to be increasing how many carbohydrates you're going to be eating in your day as your training progresses. So when you're in your early stages and training about an hour a day, you're going to aim for 5 to 7 grams per kilogram per day, and that's going to increase to 6 to 10 as you go up to 1 to 3 hours, and then 8 to 12 when you're at the high training days. Pre-exercise, all depends on kind of the length of your race or your event that you're carb loading for. If it's a shorter event, you're going to aim for about 6 to 12 grams per kilogram per day. If it's a longer event, you're going to aim for more of a 10 to 12 grams per kilogram per day in the 24 hours leading up to the event. And then right before the event, like an hour to 4 prior to the event, you're going to do that glycogen storage top off, about 1 to 4 grams per kilogram of an easy to digest carbohydrate. During your race, you're going to try to keep your energy stores high with just doses of carbohydrates. And these are the simple carbohydrates, the chews and goos and sports drinks, whatever tastes best to you in that situation. About 30 to 60 grams per hour in shorter races and 60 to 90 grams per hour as tolerated in the longer races. And just, again, this is just something that you need to practice to see what you tolerate, what you feel best on, because remember, the higher doses can lead to some GI upset. After you finish exercising, in that first 24 hours after that major race or training session, you're going to try to increase your carbohydrate intake so that you can, replete all the stores that you used. And that's more like 8 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. And then especially those first 3 to 5 hours, you want to try focusing on increasing your carbohydrate intake to about 0.8 grams per kilogram per hour. And then just as far as fat is that you just don't want to underestimate it's important in your diet. And so just make sure you're not restricting it to less than 20% of your total caloric energy. And then just ensuring that what you are taking in is of a healthier source to kind of support all of your training needs. I just want to thank you for listening to my discussion on nutrition for endurance. I hope this gives you some valuable information that you can take into your training and that it helps you prevent some suboptimal performance and that you feel good throughout your race and you can maintain your energy. Just for reference, I added a couple of articles that you can look at if you need some more clarification, if you want to do a little further investigation. But again, I just want to thank you for your time and I appreciate you joining us.